So what we have is a situation where you do not have any serious public discussion of these kinds of issues. These kinds of things should have been debated in Parliament at the time the whole thing was being passed. But you had a situation where governments time and again have abused it, taken on liabilities which the government itself will be responsible for, but to very little benefit of the people. We have a very poor quality of discussion in the country. It's all about ethnicity, it's all about religion and so on. We do not have a high quality discussion, and we won't progress with this kind of situation.
Today we have a very special guest. He's a senior advisor at Khazanah Research Institute. He's the founder director of the Independent Institute of Social Analysts. He served on the board of United Nations Research Institute on Social Development, and this is in Geneva. And he's also one of the 5 members of the Councils of Eminent Persons, sometimes also known as the Jedi Council. And he's no other than a prominent economist, Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Welcome to the show, Jomo.
Thank you, Frankie.
From the early days, I think you had your education from all around the world, right? From the UK to Malaysia, you went to Yale, and then you got your PhD in Harvard. As one of the most prominent and well-quoted economists in Malaysia, could you share with us your background and your journey to being so well-respected around the world?
Actually, I think my formation in Malaysia is more important than having been to international institutions.
Oh, okay.
So I grew up in Penang until I was 14, and then I went to the military college in Sungai Besi for slightly over 3 years before leaving, and then later on I was very lucky to get a scholarship to go to Yale. And after Yale, I also got another fellowship to go to Harvard. But my father died during my first year at Harvard, so that interrupted my plans, but I was able to supplement my income and complete my studies there. I came back, however, to write my thesis, and that was very important in terms of grounding myself in Malaysian realities. Eventually, many years later, I went to work at the United Nations in the year 2005.
Okay.
It's been a long time. And I was in the United Nations system for about 11 years before I decided to come back to Malaysia, because I felt I was not able to make any useful contributions anymore in the UN system.
What were you doing in the United Nations at that time?
I was probably the first person in the position I had, which was to improve the quality of economic and social research at the United Nations. For many developing countries especially, they count on the UN. They don't really trust the IMF or the World Bank or any of the other institutions. So we had relatively modest amount of resources in terms of economic as well as human resources compared to the World Bank and so on. But we tried to punch above our weight, and I think we did a fairly good job. So we were quite trusted, at least during the time I was there, and gained a lot of confidence of developing countries and revived caucus of the developing countries called the G77. And that was very important. Our work was increasingly cited, and particularly with the 2008 global financial crisis, we were much more trusted than, say, the IMF or the World Bank.
Yeah, because you were seen as an independent research house, right, so to speak.
Not really. We were with the UN, but the UN was seen as representing the global majority rather than the people with money. Because the IMF and the World Bank, it's $1, one vote, not one country, one vote.
And how is it different from the work that you have done with Khazanah Research Institute? Is it the same kind of social economic analysis, or is it something different?
It's quite different for 2 reasons. One is that at the UN, we were mainly interested in looking at the world and trying to understand the problems which developing countries especially were facing. And, we were not looking at any particular region. We had to look at the whole world. That was our obligation. And on many controversial issues which continue to be unresolved to this day. Khazanah Research Institute bears the name of Khazanah, which is the main funder, but it no longer is part of the Khazanah group of companies as required by US law. So at Khazanah Research Institute, we have been mainly interested in socio-economic policy research. So we are trying to influence in a variety of areas. So personally, I've worked quite a bit on questions of food security and especially on nutrition, trying to improve the quality of health and so on. Another strong personal interest of mine is improving healthcare in this country. So our perspectives are perhaps a bit different in the sense we emphasize much more on preventive health. Others would be mainly concerned about how you can make more money from providing medical services, how you can build hospitals and make money, how you can attract medical tourists from other countries. Our concern is mainly with the welfare and well-being of the Malaysian public.
Right. So this is a different impression that I have on Khazanah Research Institute, which I have this idea where it is used by Khazanah's fund managers to actually look for investment ideas in order to grow their money. But from what you mentioned just now, is more on the social economic kind of materials.
I'm not surprised that you have that impression because there is something else called CRIS, Khazanah Research Investment Services, and they do that type of research which you referred to. There tends to be a lot of confusion among many people because they are much more prominent, they are much more important for the operations of Khazanah Nasional Berhad. But our name is really because of the historical link and the ongoing funding. They do not interfere with our research agenda, which was set up basically by the founders. And so KRI is actually quite independent of Khazanah Nasional Berhad.
Well, you are quite well versed in Malaysian economics and all that. So I want to take this opportunity, since you are here, to talk a little bit about Malaysian economics in the past, especially during Tun Mahathir times when he was the Prime Minister, right? So during his tenure in the 90s, one of the most bold move that he made was to privatize Malaysian institutions to be private companies. And I think you were quite critical about it. Why is that so? Wouldn't that lighten off the government's burden to have to fund this kind of institutions?
On the contrary, the private sector is primarily interested in making money, right? So they will only take those things which can make money, and they will try to get it at a song, so to maximize their earnings capacity. They are not interested in doing things, for example, which governments have to do to serve the people. So if you take the most profitable or the most potentially money-making parts out of a system and give it to the private sector, you end up with all the costly stuff which governments have to do. And so you actually end up with a dysfunctional system because usually in most large systems you have cross-subsidization. You know, if you are making money, you would cross-subsidize those parts of the organization which are not making money, but which are deemed to be important for the organization. So if you do that, which is what Mrs. Thatcher initiated during the 1980s, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. What the public sector does turns out to be not money losing rather than money making. Okay? Whereas, in fact, there is a great deal of evidence in the world that government-owned organizations can actually be run very well. If you take, for example, Singapore, the single largest asset owner in Singapore is the Singapore government. They are run quite well. Most of them are run quite well. And nobody would say that, just because you have government ownership, it runs badly. Likewise, if you think about the most efficient steel maker in the world, at the end of the 20th century, it was a company called Pohang Steel Corporation, or POSCO, that was in Korea. Since the beginning of the 21st century, it has been something else called Bao Steel, which was in a suburb of Shanghai, but Shanghai has expanded a great deal, so it's no longer a suburb, right? It's part of Shanghai. So the point is, you can ensure that public state-owned enterprises are run well. And this is actually very important for the functioning of governments. If you condemn governments to always running things badly, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you structure the incentives, you structure the system in such a way as to cause that.
Right. But that's exactly the issue, right? I mean, our public sector is not the most efficient sector in the past. Maybe it has improved over time, but it still has a lot of room for improvement. So during that time, maybe the government didn't have the resources to make it efficient, and therefore the Prime Minister decided to privatize and perhaps learn from the private sectors first, and then only do something else.
You're attributing motives to the Prime Minister, which I'm not sure the evidence suggests that. Okay, Prime Minister was very ideologically committed to privatization. He saw it as necessary for whatever reasons. The historical record is quite clear. And in fact, many of the privatizations may have enriched many people. Some would allege many of them were so-called cronies. But the evidence is not there that things have been much more efficiently run as a consequence of privatization. Because very often in large organizations, even if private, they may not necessarily be very efficiently run. So there's a lot of debate in organization theory, which suggests the evidence is actually quite mixed. If you look, for example, at the UK, where many more studies have been done than in most other countries, the only successful privatization was of something called National Freight. Mrs. Thatcher privatized a great deal, and National Freight was privatized. It was privatized as an ESOP, Employee Share Ownership Program or something like that. And as a consequence of that, the drivers of the trucks were incentivized to do this. Elsewhere, and all the other privatizations, there is no evidence that you had superior outcomes.
It's all for profit.
Not only for profit, things were running very poorly. For example, the train system in the UK, most people would concede quite readily that train systems in the UK are not exactly terribly well run.
It's true.
Yeah, and then if you look at other examples in Europe, in Hungary, for example, there was a very successful privatization of retail enterprises. Okay, so you had these retail enterprises which were privatized to the retail shop owners. So the retail shop owners basically reorganized the enterprises to suit their own priorities. So, for example, their opening hours were no longer set centrally, but they were set according to when they thought they could make money and so on and so forth. So very often Hungarian retail shop privatizations are cited as a success story. But most of the other things we normally talk about have not been success stories. And the question is why this is the case. And you have to ask yourself the question, for example, everybody likes to talk about how wonderful Singapore is and so on and so forth. Why Singapore has not privatized many of their operations. And if you look at what has been happening recently in the last 2 years or so in the West, now everybody is talking about increasing government leadership and guidance, for example, for the West to become more competitive with China and so on. If you look at the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, it is a big push towards promoting things like reducing global warming and so on and so forth. Now, those things are not going to happen on their own unless you provide the incentives and the structures to do so. Now, in the US, because of the history of private enterprise, this happens, they do it by government intervention, which does not involve government ownership. But even if you look at the instances of government ownership, if you look, for example, take COVID-19. Who did the research for the vaccines, leaving aside the controversies about the vaccines? They were basically government funded, whether it is Moderna in the US or BioNTech in Germany. Both of them were government funded. But if you look at who had the crucial patents, in the case of what is called the CRISPR techniques, these were developed by 3 women quite some time ago. And they didn't want to have, patents because for them, this would enable the technology to be widely used. Right. Once you have patents, you charge for everything, you might become personally rich, but the technology is going to be less widely used. If you look at Sarah Gilbert, the professor at Oxford, she said no patent for the Oxford vaccine. Of course, the private pharmaceutical companies were very upset, and they rubbished it like anything. But if you look at the efficacy, there's no strong evidence that it was less efficacious than the others. So the whole story is actually a very complex story, but if we look at the evidence, many of the claims made about the superiority of private enterprise leave a lot to be desired. What do you expect the private enterprise people to say? They're going to speak out in their own self-interest and so on. But I think it is our responsibility as independent researchers to get to the truth of the matter. I'm not saying that everything done by the private sector has been rubbish and everything by the public sector has been great. There's a lot of abuse in the public sector. There's no doubt about that. But there are ways by which you can check those kinds of problems.
So you think the current government's move to privatize 4 of the major highways by Amanat Rakyat Berhad, you think it's a good move, right? To actually bring it back under the government's purview. But then the question would be, in order to bring back all the other concessionaire that is out there today, it requires a lot of public fundings. And most likely Malaysia would not have that kind of money to do that kind of privatization exercise. But number one, I guess my question would be, do you think that's a good move? And number 2, should the government continue to pursue to bring back all these big services back to the government's management, so to say?
I was among those in the late 1980s who opposed the privatization of the North-South Highway. And I remain quite critical of private highway development. And I do not believe it was necessary then. And as Tun Mahathir himself admitted, the privatization of the North-South Highway to an UMNO-related company was to save UMNO financially. Because at that time, UMNO had committed itself to building something called the Putra World Trade Center. That whole building cost a lot of money, and they had to fund it. They had to find money. And so they used the money they were making from the North-South Highway. There is no evidence, as we showed at that time, that it was necessary to privatize it. And Tun Mahathir himself explained this very clearly in those days. So the question is not, it was not as if it needed to be privatized in the first place. The question now is, what is the best use of limited government resources? Because what we have seen is that government after government after government has tried to be popular by cutting taxes. Okay? So we have what you can call tax populism. You don't collect much revenue, and you have a lot of liabilities. And the result has been that government has been withdrawing. Now, within this complex situation, should we actually have prioritized the nationalization or renationalization of the highways rather than use it, for example, to increase healthcare funding or to have a universal school feeding program for all children in this country? I think the latter two are much more the priorities I would recommend rather than using scarce resources for this purpose. But I know that there are some politicians who are perhaps influential with the present government who have favored doing what is being done. So, it's not as if they are consistent, Most of the time they are arguing that, private enterprise is better, but when it comes to the North-South Highway, they want to renationalize. And not only that, there would be no revenue stream for some of them. Okay, I'm not sure what the exact plans are, but the idea is to make them toll-free. Now, the whole thing has been built. You're basically going to remove a very modest source of revenue for the government. So I think we have to think very seriously about, if you keep on giving all these opportunities to the private sector, that's bad enough. But right now, when you have very little money, because we have already reached a spending limit, which the government itself established under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. When you have that kind of situation, you have to think and weigh and consider the different options available.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason why the government is trying to increase their revenue by increasing the SST, and they're trying to do some tax reform and stuff like that in 2024 itself. But do you think that itself is sufficient? Or is there other ways that the government can increase their revenue?
It's not clear to me that the government has done very much to increase revenue. What you say is talk, rumors, and so on and so forth, but there's no evidence that this is going to happen. Okay, I've been disappointed that the budgets have not addressed this question. Instead, you pass legislation with the Fiscal Responsibility Act when you've already exceeded that limit. What is the point of doing that, So basically, you're going into a situation where you have a crisis not only in Malaysia, in the world, where governments need what is called fiscal space, need to be able to spend money. For example, if this COVID-19 situation deteriorates further, you may need to spend quite a bit of money to address this thing. Okay, but if you tie your hands and say no more spending, what does that mean? I appreciate that the government wants to send a very clear signal that they're not going to be fiscally irresponsible in the way that recent governments have been. That is to be appreciated. But you do not go into a battle saying that I'm not going to use all this firepower. That's not the way you do it. You have very serious problems. You have problems, the fact that the national economy, we now have what is clearly a new Cold War. Okay? And countries, developing countries especially, are being forced to take sides. Okay? And my own view is that we should not take sides. We should not be pro-US or pro-China.
We can't anyway because we're a trading nation and we rely on both sides of the world to do trades, right?
Yeah, we are a trading nation, but trading nations are being forced. The US, for example, has this policy called friend-shoring. Only if you are our good friends, we will put our investments in your country. Of course, they cannot control the private sector entirely, and there seems to be a lot of private interest in coming to Malaysia. But it's one thing to say, it's another thing to actually bring the resources in. But I'm more interested not in foreign investments in this country, but in Malaysian investments. Where are Malaysian entrepreneurs going to, how are they going to develop? What are the areas they're going to be developing in? And there's so many relatively low-hanging fruits, in my view, which we have not had the consistent push for. Let me just give you two, since everybody is concerned about global warming these days. One is in the 1980s, Tan Sri Augustine Ong and Tan Sri Yusof Basiron, both at that time in Porim, were talking about biodiesel from palm oil.
Oh, it was during the 80s already people talking about this?
Yes.
Right.
And what's happened since? Yeah. Relatively little.
Until very recently only we started to introduce biodiesel.
But, it was only because Indonesia was surging ahead. Wherever we've had leadership, we have considered that leadership without being asked to. We just gave up because you have every government trying to do something novel, sometimes for no rhyme or reason, just to be different, just to be novel. So it's not necessarily in the best interest of the public. So we lost that effort. I'll give you another example. Photovoltaic solar panels. Okay,
we are quite strong in this area, right?
Well, the number one producer and exporter in the world is China. Number two are Malaysia and South Korea, both over 7% of world. Now, the difference between Malaysia is that almost all our photovoltaic solar panels are exported. Okay, whereas the Chinese and the Korean ones are really used for domestic. In the Korean case, it's just because they're too expensive. In the Chinese case, because of restrictions imposed by the West and so on. So this basically means that Malaysia has this. But if you look at the companies which are producing, they're almost all foreign companies. It's not as if the technology is that different. Yeah. The technology has remained fundamentally stable for 3 decades, since the mid-1990s. And the unit cost of producing energy using this has basically declined only slightly. In other words, there's very little major technological change involved. But there's only one major Malaysian company involved. And in a photovoltaic solar panel, there are less than 200 components. In a proton, we have more than 4,000 components. You can produce a proton, but you don't make an effort to produce this. And if you look at the Chinese companies, for example, most of them were not around 15 years ago. They have come in lately. But when they come in, they go in a very, very big way. And many of them were trained by people I know. That training could have been done for Malaysians. But you need some kind of direction. Obviously, relying on the private sector has not succeeded. Obviously, you need to have some kind of government leadership.
But that seems to be the strategy still going forward, because for the first 9 months in 2023, the Prime Minister managed to brought in 230 billion ringgit worth of foreign direct investments into Malaysia.
Those are not actual direct investments. Those are
MOUs and stuff like that.
Indications of investments. I don't want to trivialize that. Those can be very, very important. My point is not that. My point is, what about Malaysian entrepreneurs? Are we so hopeless
Until we
that,
need
that we
foreigners to
only
come in.
need foreigners? I mean, you look at Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. How much foreign direct investment do they rely
very
on?
little.
Even China, which relies more on foreign direct investment compared to the other three I mentioned, even China doesn't have this kind of privileging of foreign direct investment that we do. So we privilege the foreign direct investment, we give them tax exemptions, we give them all kinds of subsidies, while we neglect our own entrepreneurs. I mean, there are lots of small and medium industrial enterprises, yeah? I'm not talking about, building hotels and things like that. I'm talking about industrial enterprises, which are operating, for example, in the Port Klang area. Yeah, somebody told me that it's close to 1,500. I don't know the actual numbers, but the fact of the matter is that most of these people do not get government support of any form. They actually fear the government, okay, because the government is seen as regulatory and so on, and privileging foreign direct investments. So we have this ironic situation. And so for Malaysian companies, some Malaysians with money who want to invest with ideas and so on, what do?
They go overseas.
They go overseas and come back into Malaysia as foreign direct investment. I mean, this is ridiculous. Right? It's ridiculous, But this is precisely why we need to sort out this situation. We are not going to become a world leader in anything just because of foreign direct investment. E&E, electric and electronics. We have supposedly been a world leader for half a century. When you really look at it, it's just foreign companies.
End of the supply chain.
No. Even if you go up some of the testing and so on, which is done, which is higher end, but it's still, you are basically happen to be the convenient location. And what you do, you keep on depressing wages and working conditions for Malaysian workers by, for example, having more and more foreign workers. So you have an ironic situation where you are actually not only giving them all kinds of tax and other incentives, you're also depressing wages. Once upon a time, we were a country where they used to call a labor surplus, depressed working conditions. But you can't go through life forever like that. We have to learn. I mean, Tun Mahathir once had an interesting policy called Look East. We have to learn from Japan. We have to learn from Korea. We have to learn from Taiwan. We have to learn from China. We have to learn from Vietnam. We have to learn from Indonesia. If you look at some of the latest innovations in Indonesia, you have dwarf oil palm trees. The tree doesn't grow to more than 4 meters. Okay, right now in Malaysia, we have oil palm trees, and once they grow beyond a certain height, we cut the whole tree down. The tree is cut down usually around 25 years or so, plus or minus 5 years. Okay, so the first 5 years it's not productive, or first 4 years it's not productive, and then you cut it down at a certain age. Now, once you have a dwarf tree, what does it mean?
You can always harvest it.
Yeah, because the natural life of oil palm tree is about 90 years.
90 years?
Yes.
Oh, that I didn't know.
Yeah.
I always thought that it is 25 to 30
maybe
years.
it's less productive in the 89th year or the 85th year or whatever. But let us say 80 years. Okay, what does it mean, right? We are cutting short the natural life of a tree. Now, if you have this, it fundamentally changes the options. And who developed this? Malaysian agronomists working in Indonesia. I mean, this is the ironic situation. We are not making use of Malaysian expertise in industry, in agriculture, in a whole variety of areas, while you are privileging foreign direct investment. To what end? So I'm not saying we don't have any foreign direct investment, but let's be selective and stop falling over ourselves in giving them all kinds of privileges.
Right. Well, those are great insights, and I think you kind of had a chance to express yourself when you were one of the 5 members of the Council of the Eminent Persons, the Jedi Council. But unfortunately, I think there was no report produced by the Council. Maybe you can share with us, were there like some sort of suggestion to the government on all these points that you just shared with us just now?
It is true that while I was a member of the council, and Tan Sri Hassan Marikan as well, no report was produced involving us. Subsequently, there was a report which I'm not sure who authored it. It was announced by Tun Daim together with Tan Sri Zeti and Robert Koch's representative. Okay, so I don't really know much about this report. That report, it's up to them because I was not party to it. It's not for me to release that report. But certainly, I think Tun Daim has made clear that he's got nothing against. He's quite keen for that report to be published. At least this is what he said some years ago. There was another report. I think it was called the Law Reform Committee, and this was Tun Daim had asked some people. Created this subcommittee with some very prominent lawyers on law reform. And they prepared a report led by an eminent former judge. And that report was prepared by that committee. I suddenly saw that report. I don't necessarily subscribe to all its proposals. But again, there's absolutely no reason why that report should not be in the public sphere. So I have no objections to those reports coming out, but certainly there was no report which I was party to. The point is that we didn't agree on many things, on most things. So I cannot say that there's any basis for a report which we would sign up for. And but it doesn't mean that we didn't use our time well. We made a lot of proposals. They were not fully formed proposals in many instances. I'll give you one example. I wanted to close down the ECRL.
Oh.
Okay.
Why?
Because the whole thing was corrupt from the beginning. I mean, everybody knew that. It was an open secret. Many of my classmates in school later became engineers. And consulting many of them, they basically took the view that the ECRL could have been built for 17 billion. Okay. When Dato' Sri Najib announced the project in late 2017, before the general election, the number cited was 81 billion. Okay, 17 to 81. Consider it's 5 times more. Okay, the rumor is that some of that money was to cover up 1MDB, some of that money was for the last general election, and whatever. Okay, I don't want to get into all that thing because we don't have very clear and conclusive evidence on this. But it was never going to make money, and I tried to get it cancelled, and others felt that they wanted to come up with alternative schemes. Okay, so I think some of Tun Daim's friends came up with the idea of going through Bahau, so avoiding the
slopey terrain and stuff like that, right?
No, avoiding the tunnel. And now what has happened? It's back. But with a budget at a cost 18 billion or so less than the original cost. Now, how do you cut 18 billion? In other words, the whole thing was overpriced to begin with. Okay, and I believe that it could have been further cut. Okay, so we have a lot of nonsense like that which happens. I mean, but it became almost regular because you kept on pushing all these projects, including some of the MRTs and whatnot, which are terribly overpriced and basically will never pay for themselves. So you're burdening the government, not only the present government, but future governments, and you're basically pushing a lot of debt which will need to be paid. Going back to the ECRL, for example, the deal was that for the first 7 years, nothing needed to be paid. It didn't mean that the interest didn't accumulate. Interest accumulated, but that's why you needed to pay eventually. As the projection was that you would pay over 110 billion. Okay? Of course, things have changed since then, but that was the extent of the burden. And who would pay? Younger people, your generation, not me. Okay? So what we have is a situation where you do not have any serious public discussion of these kinds of issues. These kinds of things should have been debated in Parliament at the time the whole thing was being passed. But you had a situation where governments time and again have abused it, taken on liabilities which the government itself will be responsible for, and ultimately the people of the country will be responsible for, but to very little benefit of the people. So we have a very poor quality of discussion in the country. It's all about ethnicity, it's all about religion and so on. We do not have a high quality discussion, and we won't progress with this kind of situation. Just hoping for the private sector to solve all these problems. These problems will not be resolved just by wishful thinking.
So what do you think the government should do next time we have a mega infrastructure project that is coming up? The most immediate one that I can think of is the upcoming MRT3, whereby most of the lines will be underground because there's not much space for you to build above the ground, right? And that is going to cost a lot more money. Yeah, again, we will go back to the issue of whether the government is overspending and whether the budget is being used efficiently and stuff like that.
These are very detailed issues, okay? I mean, the devil is in the detail. You cannot talk very glibly about these issues. And what makes you so sure that MRT3 is worth funding? There are many issues which need to be addressed. Improving the quality of public transportation, generally speaking. It all doesn't hinge on MRT3. There was a lot of talk, very loose talk about, how all these things were necessary for the future of the government. Well, what is very clear is that ECRL is not only not going to benefit the nation at all, but it won't even help the people in the East Coast. When you think about it, and the idea of having a high-speed railway from the East Coast, can you imagine so many people wanting to come from the East Coast to KL on a daily basis? I mean, the whole thing was basically to create jobs for the boys, as they would say. And this is the problem. Once we have these kinds of abuses, the sky is the limit. And unfortunately, the way the system has changed, although, to be fair, the government's recent Fiscal Responsibility Act will at least check some of these abuses. Previously, you didn't go to Parliament at all on state-owned enterprise or so-called GLC debt liabilities which are guaranteed by the government. Now, there will be a greater degree of transparency and accountability with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. But as I said earlier, the Fiscal Responsibility Act also ties the hands of government in a way which is not exactly the most important priority at this point.
Right. Well, one of the priority of the government is probably subsidy rationalization in 2024, tax the rich and give it back to the poor. Do you think that's a good strategy?
My friend, the late Professor Ismail Saleh, showed that we all like to think that taxes are taken from the well-to-do and passed to the poor. In fact, this is not the case. Okay, the word which is normally used is that it's in fact regressive rather than progressive. Okay, so the tax man is not Robin Hood. Okay, to put it in popular terms. Now, conversely, and this work was extended subsequently by Professor Wee Chong Hui, who unfortunately has not been working on these issues for the last 2 decades or so. But at least through the 20th century, this was the case. And there's no reason to believe that things have improved. In fact, the tax changes which were introduced by Tun Daim in 1984 for the 85 budget and the tax changes introduced by Najib particularly have been all regressive rather than progressive. Now, on the spending side, has the government been progressive? Again, we all think, this government is spending for all these poor people and so on and so forth. Let's face it, when you really look at the budget, where the money goes and so on, what goes to some poor people is really paltry. And when you really look at the numbers, it's not much. And furthermore, to add insult to injury, a lot of that is siphoned off by politicians and whatnot. You have a lot of problems on this side. But there was an economist, I think, sent by the World Bank named Jacob Meerman, who wrote a book called Public Expenditure in Malaysia. And he too showed that contrary to the prevailing myth that government spending is progressive, it is actually regressive. So both on the tax side as well as on the spending side, the fiscal role of government, to use the technical term, is actually regressive rather than progressive. But this is a popular myth. A lot of people believe it.
Yeah, sounds like there are a lot of things that the government needs to do in order to get Malaysian economy back on track, right? But in your opinion, how do you think the Malaysian economy will pan out in 2024 with all the initiatives that the government has put in place?
Well, I think much, much more needs to be done, particularly to move Malaysian enterprise.
Okay.
And I'm referring mainly to private enterprise
Right.
as well. You
Right.
know?
Because there are already some initiatives like the new industrial master plan, the new energy transformation plan. This kind of strategies or framework has been put in place. I think partly to encourage domestic investment as well. Would that be enough, or do you think these are just marketing gimmicks? And
I don't think they're necessarily marketing gimmicks. I think a lot of effort has been put into these plans. But the fact of the matter is that many of these plans have not meant very much. I'll give you a couple of examples from Tun Mahathir's first decade in office in the 1980s. The last act of Tun Hussein was to pass the Fourth Malaysia Plan. Then he steps down as Prime Minister. Tun Mahathir takes it over, and within a couple of years, the Fourth Malaysia Plan is largely history, because
he had a new economic plan.
No. To be fair, at that time there were some economic difficulties in the world, not Malaysia's doing, but in the world, because monetary crisis, a financial crisis, debt crisis, particularly affecting Latin American countries, but also affecting other countries, Africa and so on and so forth. Asia was not so badly affected because we hadn't borrowed very much at that time yet. But the international conditions were not conducive, and Tun Mahathir basically put that aside. 5 years later, the Fifth Malaysia Plan is proposed. And within less than a year, it is abandoned. Because the Fifth Malaysia Plan, if you go back and read the document, envisaged a big government role. But around the same time, again, there was a financial problem, and Tun Mahathir used that problem to say, okay, we are going to go private. So privatization was announced. So a lot of things which were in the Fifth Malaysia Plan were largely, put aside. Now, the other thing which is very important is that there was something else called the First IMP. So the recent Industrial Master Plan is the fourth one. So the first IMP came out around 1986. And the minister at that time was Tunku Razali, who shortly thereafter got into a political contest with Tun Mahathir. That was the end of that plan. His successor, Tan Sri Rafida, basically didn't particularly care for it, and that was the end of that plan. The second Industrial Master Plan, Tan Sri Rafida was still there, didn't particularly believe in all this stuff. Right. Again, it didn't go anywhere. There were also many other factors internationally and so on. I don't think politicians and policymakers can control all the factors, okay?
So, but there's always policies, but the implementation is the one that's lacking.
No, it's not a question of implementation.
Oh.
They don't believe in it.
But they were the ones who drafted those policies.
So what? Okay? Because you have a culture, government servants, for example. In the old days, in the 70s, people took the Malaysia plans very, very seriously, especially during the first decade of the NEP. That was the period of the highest growth Malaysia has ever experienced during the 1970s, for a variety of factors which I won't get into right now. And so people who say, oh, you cannot have growth and redistribution at the same time, they are wrong. The fact is that growth happened with redistribution. A lot of women went into the labor force. There was full employment after the unemployment of the 1960s. So the economy was doing extremely well during the 1970s. Of course, the discovery of oil helped. High oil prices helped. But those were not crucial to what was happening. Now, I'm not saying we return to the 1970s, but the fact of the matter was that why does Tun Hussein feel it's so important to launch the Malaysia Plan before stepping down?
I'm not sure.
Well, because he took it very, very seriously. Because of its impact. The Third Malaysia Plan was very significant. It was basically drafted under Tun Razak's leadership, took it very seriously, and then later on, Tun Hussein, who succeeded Tun Razak, tried to implement it. Okay, but it was Tun Razak who was the real game changer in a way. Okay, so the plans were taken very, very seriously in those days. But
these days just plan only, don't care.
No, Tun Mahathir was is probably still very much influenced by the new thinking which was happening internationally with the rise of Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan, who had become president of the US. Their view was completely different from the American so-called New Deal and others. So they, for example, you take something called the National Health Service in the UK. It's probably the most significant achievement of the UK in the post-war period.
Yeah.
But Mrs. Thatcher, she knew it was very popular, so she did not directly attack it, but she basically created the conditions to undermine it. And so now people go around saying, oh, this National Health Service is rubbish, it failed, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter was that it was very, very significant. But of course, it has been deteriorating like anything over the recent decades. But the point is that a lot of this was driven by ideology. The thinking that, oh, only the private sector can get things done, only this, only that, and so on. What happened? You gave it to the private sector. When they fail, you rescue them. I mean, a lot of government resources were spent rescuing private sector people.
And history keeps repeating itself decades over decades.
Well, it doesn't quite repeat itself, the changing conditions, but in a sense, there is some repetition. Yeah.
Well, before I let you go, Prof, I think today you have shared quite a lot of insights about the world economy to Malaysia, how it impacts us as Malaysian and things like that. But before I let you go, I just want to play this scenario. If today you have the chance to produce that report again as the member of the Council of the Eminent Person, and you were to submit it to the government, what would be the top priority on that report?
I think it's very difficult to ask and answer that question without looking at context. Okay. Firstly, I need to know what kind of influence I would have in terms of seeing implementation of a report. When I was younger, I would dream of changing the world, right? Today, I have much more modest aims. So my priorities today now to improve healthcare financing for healthcare in this country, so that you really realize something the government has committed to verbally, but never done much to implement, which is universal healthcare or healthcare for all. Okay, we've had this on our books. Now, if you look at Malaysian government spending, when you compare health, we spend relatively little, but we've actually used to have very good outcomes. Okay, it's gone downhill in recent decades, but nonetheless, it's not too bad. If you compare that with education, we spend even more on education, but unfortunately with very sad outcomes. So I think we have to recognize the achievements on health, but the achievements can be much more significant. You know, not everything costs a lot of money. Say prevention. Okay, there are many conditions which women face, for example, problems which health issues they face, for which, you know, you can overcome the problems simply by having, for example, regular screening for cervical cancer and so on and so forth, or, you know, for ensuring that young girls have enough iron in their blood. You know, women have generally, when they come of age, they basically need more iron in their blood because, you know, they menstruate every month. Okay, this is not the case for men. So the needs of women are different from men. So there are, just as over your life cycle, the needs of your children, I don't know whether you have children, are different, quite different from the needs of your grandparents, for example. So we have to take all these things into consideration. You know, it's not one size fits all kinds of policies. So in the 1960s, a very simple innovation, not very expensive, was introduced. Namely to have what was called bidan kampung, midwife in villages. Now, at that time, more than 90% of the, about 90% of the population lived in rural areas. Today, people live in urban areas, and you find that many young children in urban areas actually have very poor health outcomes, partly because we are not taking into consideration how the country has changed, you know. And the rural areas have not improved either. I mean, you look at some of the poor areas in this country, which most people don't see, okay? Because we live in our urban comfort and relative comfort, and we don't see what is happening. Even in urban areas, there are pockets of misery. And what do? Our ostensible solution, you go and catch a lot of foreign workers and so on and so forth. They are struggling to make a living, but by treating them poorly, we actually end up indirectly treating poor workers, Malaysian workers, poorly as well. We shouldn't think if you benefit, it's at my expense. You know,
We should have mutual benefit.
yeah, exactly. You know, we have nice slogans, mutual benefit, shared prosperity, blah blah blah. But what are we doing about it? So we have to start thinking very differently. But the politicians, instead of providing that kind of leadership, are actually not helping with the kind of discourse which has dominated Malaysian society for decades, arguably since the 1950s.
Maybe to do that, the first step is to collect data effectively, to have more accurate data per se, right? And maybe that's why the government has launched the new Padu app where people need to go online and register themselves, stuff like that, right? But anyways, thank you so much for your time, Prof. Really, I enjoyed myself throughout the entire session. Hopefully to get you up on the show again sometime in the future. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Frankie.
Thanks.